Hello everyone, I'm Isaac and I'm back with more social research discussions. So today I want to talk about the first methodological step. So now it's getting into the nitty-gritty or the meat of what social research methodologies are. And the first step in any project, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, right? Whether you're dealing with a few people and you're trying to go in depth, or whether you're dealing with a large number of people and just trying to look at matters of scale or proportion, right? For all of this, you need to do sampling first. You need to have a sample in mind. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, sampling and the importance of it. So, the thing about samples, right? If you are interested to understand something or to understand a certain group of people, or, well, whatever that might be, even, right? Ideally, you can talk to everybody in here, you can learn about their lives, you can then summarize all the data and make sense of it collectively out of everybody in this group. Now, the thing is, you will not have the resources to reach out to every single person in this group. Most of the time, issues of time come up, issues of money come up. If you want to do a survey and you have someone going out to talk to 100 people, you got to pay the person who went to talk to 100 people a bunch of money. If it's you, you got to pay yourself a bunch of money, right? You'll need food to stay alive, have energy to do that at the very least. So even that is very expensive. And time, if you're going and doing like 2 hour qualitative interviews, 2 hour focus groups with people, you won't have the time to do this with every single person who may be in your group of interest. So, this group of interest, this is also known by the theoretical term of the population. A population in, well, science, right, should be treated as a theoretical group of interest. If I am interested in the population of Singapore, right, then it has to be something about Singapore specifically that I am interested in. Maybe I only want to know about the Singaporean citizens, something specific Singaporean citizens, maybe it has to do with voting or whatever. Then my population is not the population of all of Singapore, but it's just the citizens who happen to be in Singapore, so on and so forth. So, for all of this, you want your sample to be a representation of your theoretical group of interest, of your population. And if your sample doesn't represent this population, right, then whatever you do after that, it's pointless. It doesn't make sense. Let's say I want to talk about residents in Singapore, people who stay in Singapore over the long term and their experiences here. And I go out there and interview a bunch of tourists. The data that the tourists tell me, their experiences, the information, while it's interesting and it's rich, it does not have anything to do with what I'm interested in know. Because the tourists are here for a while and then they're gone. So your sample needs to represent your population, and it's very important you do that. The thing is, right, these terms of sample and population, and I guess this is a summary of what I just spoke about, it's a matter of resources. You want to study the full population interest, and so you cannot do that. So you just take a sample of it, and this is a way to think about it: the full group interest and a subset of this full group. The thing about representation now, right? How do you achieve this? What even counts as representation? This is another level of theoretical ideas, another level of planning. You can think about this as planning as well. You have to plan your samples. And there's two very broad approaches to planning your sample to ensure that, well, not ensure, but to like push towards representation. Some people say that, yes, I can ensure 100% that this represents it. It's very, very hard to do that. You can't, that becomes a claim that's very hard to confirm. Because to confirm that your sample does truly represent the entire population, you need to go back and get the entire population. Then you've done a census anyway. You don't have a sample anymore. It's a full thing. So most of the time, you just want to try and have some representation. Ensuring is even a slightly higher level. It's trickier, but yeah, you want to try and get as much of that. So the two broad approaches, you can think of this as probability sampling or not and non-probability sampling. So there's two approaches to this, and I'm going to go through these logics for this discussion today. So probability sampling relies on this core logic that if you have a large enough sample, right, you can represent the population. So here, the most basic version is called simple random sampling. It is as it's described. It's simple and it's random. You don't care at all. For instance, if I have a box of objects, right? Let's say I know the objects are all balls. I have a box of balls, and I just want to see the color distribution of these balls. If I take out 3 or 4 of them and let's say I take out 4 of them, and all 4 are blue in color. I can't say anything about the rest of the box being all blue. I can't say that everything in this box is blue. I have to take more, right? Because I wasn't choosing, I wasn't trying to be selective about it. I wasn't looking for like manufacturing batches or whatever. Like maybe I know this batch is all like that. I was just reaching into the box and grabbing. So if you're doing simple random sampling, you need a lot in your sample size to eventually represent the population. Let's say the box has a total of 100 balls. I take out 10 of them. 5 are red, 5 are blue out of these 10. I cannot say with any surety that the box has a 50-50 red-blue distribution. But let's say I take out 40 of them now, and 20 are red and 20 are blue. I can be a bit more sure about this, right? But I still can't say for sure. I can keep taking out more and more until I reach like 90 or 99 of the 100. And from there, I can see this distribution. Yes, okay, I am quite sure that I have represented the population with the sample. But for you to get large enough, most of the time you need a lot of samples. If we proxy this now to things with a lot more nuance than just color, right? Let's say I want to talk about, I want to understand men in Singapore. For me to understand men's opinion in, like, a guy's opinion about something, I need, or rather the male population's opinions about something, I need to be able to speak to so many men that I have a very good, if I'm not selecting them, right? If I'm not selecting, let's say, people who are shaping public discourse about what it means to be male, if I'm just picking people, I'm going in the street and like, hi, are you a man? All right, cool, you identify as male? Can you tell me your thoughts on this? If I'm simply doing that randomly, I need to speak to so many of them before I can say with any sort of surety that I am representing the population of men in Singapore. And the other thing, right, the other problem of this is not only will you not have the resource to get a large enough sample, if your sample is too small, now certain things become overrepresented or underrepresented. Like, if I'm doing a survey and I just want 100 respondents, I send out flyers for the survey. I'm standing in the street and throwing out flyers. Some people take the flyers, they go to the website and they fill it out, and that's it. The survey is done. The first 100 people respond to this survey may be a very different kind of person from the next 1,000 people respond to it, or from the next 10,000. And you can think of this in terms of so many different possible factors that you can't even account for them. For example, maybe it's capacity, right? Do they have the time to fill out a survey? Maybe it's the time of day. Was I throwing out flyers in the afternoon when some people at work and only people out of work are those without jobs, or those on leave, or those who just left school, right? Or am I throwing flyers at a certain location where some people happen to be and other people don't? So many issues of representation come into play if your sample is not large enough. And so, one of the ways that people try and compensate for this is by introducing by systemizing this probability sampling approach. It is still random, but systematic. Instead of leaving it to chance of like who's going to respond first or who's going to respond faster to the survey or to this question that I'm asking. And note, here I'm using the word survey because that's the more typical way that this is used. But you can also sample for interviews or for focus groups and all this way. I have actually sampled for focus groups this way by doing the flyer thing straight up, like standing on the street asking you, hi, would you be interested to join a focus group to talk about this topic, right? Do you want to talk about this thing with some other people? And those approaches, they work. But all of them come with the core logical problem now of who exactly are they representing. The average person on the street who wants to talk to me about something may not be the average Singaporean. And for those of you who are Singaporean audiences watching this, you're gonna like you probably know that most Singaporeans don't want to talk about things with strangers. They don't want to talk about sensitive topics or even things to do with the public in public. You wouldn't talk about the public in public to the public. You talk about public things to your friends. Like, oh yeah, why is the government doing that? Why are the trains like that? You're not going to say this is a complete stranger. So all those issues of selection, one way to try and compensate for it is by introducing systematic approaches. So this, however, requires you to know everyone in the population first. Let's say you have everybody's ID numbers. If I'm doing a survey of Singapore, right, I have everybody's ID numbers, and then now I select certain ID numbers and I call them up or I send them the flyer and ask them to fill out the form. This is a way to introduce systematicness to it. Okay. So this primarily just compensate for those like first responder, first mover issues that I described with pure random sampling, simple random sampling. Um, but it does come with the same issues of representation that other random samples have. Like, yeah, how do you know that these people do actually represent the population of interest? And one other interesting issue that arises with systematic sampling is sometimes you like certain names or certain people may like this entire first mover thing, right? Certain people may appear first on the list for certain reasons, and you may not know what these reasons are until after you get them, and you can't account for them if you don't know that. So yeah, all the issues of random sampling still show up with systematic sampling. Following that now, so representation, right? The problem with random sampling, like simple random and systematic random, is I'm not sure if this is a appropriate person for this. This person may just be very happy to share their thoughts on this topic, but they may not be someone who experiences this on a regular basis. So, stratified random sampling is a strategy that tries to account for this by you first divide your population, your group of interest, into theoretical strata, and setting quotas for each strata. So yeah, in this example on the slide, if my theoretical population is 55% female, 45% male, then I need to make sure that I set a quota of just 550 women. I don't want more than 550 women in my sample, but I can't have less than 550 women in my sample either. It has to be that number for me to now say, look, in gender breakdown, my sample represents my sample's gender breakdown represents the population's gender breakdown. This usually works with demographic features like what's described, but what's fun here is you can actually do this with discursive stances too. So let's say you have a survey where you ask them about their opinion on something, like I think Singapore should, yeah, I don't know, open its borders, or I think that the mask mandate should go away, right? If your project wants to see how people who are against masks and people who are for masks think about something else entirely, can wearing a mask be an indicator of some other view, right? Or sorry, willingness to wear a mask be an indicator of some other political view? You can make sure that your sample works this way. How this will work in practice is when you find somebody who wants to respond to your survey, you start with your filtering questions, your quota questions. So, hi, thanks for agreeing to do this survey. May I know your thoughts on a mask mandate? And they say, all right, I think it's good. All right, cool. With with a lot of digital surveys now, the very helpful thing is that it keeps a running tally of how many people you've done. So let's say they say, yeah, I'm for mask mandates. Cool. Now it checks the system. If you still need more people who say that they are for mask mandates, right? Then you can continue the survey with them. If it doesn't, then you can tell them as a surveyor, like, oh, it seems like, yeah, we fulfilled the quota for your demographic or for people like you, right? Thank you so very much for your time. Yeah, have a good day. Because now you don't need any more people for pro mask. You need other people who may be against the mask mandate. And so you do all this to set your quotas, and you can see how these quotas now have to have theoretical interests, theoretical alignments. I want to understand this from these people. This stratified random sampling, it is typically done with surveys because they want to deal with those demographic features, right? But you could also do this with anything qualitative. You could, and not every researcher will do this. Most researchers are happy. This is the interesting thing though. Most researchers are happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk to them about the topic, even if they're not very sure if they're appropriate. But it's also possible for you to save your time, or energy, right? If you realize you've spoken to a lot of men on a particular topic, and you need to hear some female opinions now. Maybe the next time a man comes to you and is like, "Hey, I want to join your interview project," then like, "Oh yeah, thank you, that's very appreciated, but I've fulfilled the quota of male respondents. Do you happen to know any women who might want to do the survey?" And can now ask them for, well, you can try and fulfill those other gender quotas. Okay, so these bits about quotas. Oh, I guess what I'm emphasizing with this, right, is the quant-qual dichotomy is relatively artificial. The techniques and the logics work across both. Yeah. Stratified random sampling, this is about setting quotas so that you ensure representation in these demographics or in these discursive stances. Another possible strategy is if you don't have a specific quota in mind, if you don't have a specific ethnicity or whatever, or a specific discursive stance that you want to look at, another way to set quotas is called multistage cluster sampling. So what happens is you mark out clusters in your population and you divide these and you set quotas, numerical quotas here now. So let's say I want to a sample of 1,000 people, right? I could select 10 neighborhoods and be like, all right, in each of these neighborhoods, I need to get 100 people. No more than 100, no less than 100. So to get these 100 people, now I'm gonna go to every address and ask, yeah, all right, at each house that does open the door and talk to me, I'm like, all right, do you live alone? Do you live with someone else? Or if you live with someone else, can both of you do this survey for me? So on and so forth. So the idea here, there is still the element of random, right? You can see how this shows up similar to simple random sampling. And the big difference here is that by setting these clusters, you also step aside from that sort of first mover thing, or from like, oh yeah, who's home, who's not home kind of thing. Because in practice, if you have a cluster and a quota for that cluster, if you knock on the door and no one answers, you come back later. Because your aim now is to really get them to respond to this. Similar to the systematic random sampling approach, where if you have their ID numbers or whatever, and they are not very eager to do it, you contact them again a couple of weeks later, like, hi, please, would you like to do this? I'll throw in a little voucher or whatever, that sort of thing. Try and find ways to persuade them. Realistically, you don't bribe them with vouchers after. Like in practice, the voucher stuff is either all or nothing. Like they always know, they don't know it from the start. In practice, how you get people to respond is to convince them that their opinion really, really matters for what's happening here. And it does. Like it should matter for your project. If their opinion does not matter for a project, then why are you picking them? Yeah. So with multi-stage cluster sampling, this usually works with geographical features, right? Like areas you can identify and be like, yeah, that is a cluster, that is a cluster. Note that you can actually also combine this idea with the quota setting of stratified random sampling. You may say that within this neighborhood, I need this gender breakdown. Within this neighborhood, I need this discursive breakdown. And that is what you can now look at to try and ensure representativeness. A problem, though, with multi-stage cluster sampling is this relies on a lot of assumptions about what the demographic breakdown is and why it's okay to cut this up. And the bigger problem with these assumptions is that most of the time you do these, you cluster them instead of setting stratified quotas, right? You cluster them instead of stratified quotas because you don't have any theoretical idea about what the breakdown is. You just know that you need to make sure that you get a certain number of respondents from each neighborhood. Certain neighborhoods may be more densely packed, for instance. Certain neighborhoods may have different gender or ethnic breakdowns than others. And then the quota you set for at the multi-stage cluster level may not represent the neighborhood anymore. You may skew it in some ways. And that's one of the issues with this. Or rather, it's a broad issue of any sort of sampling. If your theory doesn't work if you don't really have much theory, your practical side, right, this practical side of sampling now it's blind. You expose yourself to a lot of risk, and you need to, not risk, risk of error, and you need to account for these things. But if your theory is solid, but there's no way to get it there, right? Let's say you really know you want to find certain people, but you don't know where they are or how to identify them, right? Then that's another issue altogether. And that's also where non-probability approaches start to come in. So let's say you have a theoretical idea, like, yeah, I want to study, maybe why people join a social movement, right? Theoretically, I'm interested in the leaders. You could study the social movement's leaders by going to a protest or whatever, hand out flyers and be like, hi, are you a leader in this movement? If you are, sign up with me and do this interview or do this survey. But that's super inefficient, right? Like, why would you do that when you can find the specific people, try and look for them directly instead? And so if you have a clear theoretical idea about what you want, but you know and you have a rough idea about where to find them, you could just go and ask them directly. And this is the difference between probability and non-probability logics. The probability logic, it's essentially a numbers game. It hopes that if you have enough people, you will, if you have a big enough sample, it will represent what you're trying to represent. The non-probability side, however, it leans very, very heavily on your theoretical understandings. How sure are you that you can find this if you go out there? The thing is, if you're not sure that leadership matters, if you're not sure that this stuff matters, you might be much better off doing a probability approach. You go out there and you just hand out surveys to people and ask them for their opinions on social movements, or you ask them for messagings or whatever that you think they might like, right? So that is one of the big differences between probability and non-probability samplings. Focusing on purposive now. So yeah, you find just the people who are relevant for this, and this leans very, very heavily on theory. Also, the thing is, I like the probability sampling quota, where I might say that yes, I need to have 50% men, 50% women. Here, you are taking who you can get as long as they fit the criteria. You're not gonna be like, oh yeah, I have enough leaders from this group. I'm gonna find other groups now. Uh, Sometimes you don't have that choice, and this is why some people say that non-probability sampling is a much more common thing in qualitative work. Because typically in qualitative work, if you are trying to find something more, typically you approach qualitative stuff if you want to explore a specific thing very in depth, because you get to talk to them a lot more. It's not rigid questions where they have to respond. But you can do this with quant approaches as well. You may want to just find specific people, industry leaders, like I have done at a market research job. We have developed surveys where we find like industry leaders on LinkedIn and send them surveys because we just want to know how certain people view certain things. And that's also an approach. It was a quantitative approach. They responded to the survey, but yeah, we were looking for specific people. And yeah, it's just another way for me to re-emphasize that the quant-core dichotomy is very, very artificial, in my opinion. Focus instead on the logic, focus instead on what these things let you do and not do. So purposive, right? And now the next thing, sometimes if you're being very purposive about it, um, you're gonna have trouble still. Theoretically, you want to find these people, but maybe you can't, right? You can now do this thing called snowball sampling, where you no longer rely on just yourself or your team. You get other people to help. So you get relevant people to refer other relevant people to you. And this is snowballing part. So you started just a small snowball, and as you get more people involved in your project, more data, you get even more data. And a fun thing about this is that it has the big benefit of finding networked respondents. So I'm calling this fun because it has benefits and complications. Sometimes you want to know how the group came to certain ideas, so what they spoke about together, how ideas might be processed in their network. Because if you think of like in-group jokes as the most basic way, all your group chats, you might speak differently, have different jokes, different group chats. How did this come to be? This can be interesting and worth exploring. Now, if you shift that instead of, let's say, memes or in jokes, right? You shift this now to ideologies. Why might a certain group approach a social issue this way? Then it may be very useful to find that networking information. But now the next complication, even if this is still very theoretically interesting to you, these people in the network are also going to communicate to one another. Maybe about the projects that they were just involved in. Like, oh yeah, this guy interviewed me, he spoke to me about all of these things, and he wants to talk to you about all of these things too. Can you now account for what conversations they have amongst themselves before you engage in the project? Because the first person, for instance, might have zero information. The next person has maybe a bit of information. Let's call it one information. The third person has two information. The fourth person has three information, so on and so forth, right? In your analysis, how do you now account for this? Are they responding to you based off stuff that they learned before, stuff that they're thinking and reprocessing, or are they responding to you as if those engagements never happened, so on and so forth, right? There's a lot to account for, a lot to deal with, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that when I'm talking about data analysis. But yeah, at the level of sampling, those are complications to bear in mind. So this is another aspect of non-probability sampling. And now the last two simplest bits of non-probability sampling, and I've grouped them together because they're both relatively simple and the logics are very, very close to probability samplings, simple random, and quota sampling. It's just that the scale is so small that you're not even going to have a chance to argue about probability. With the box of balls example, you take out two of them and be like, yeah, I'm not even going to try and say the entire box is blue balls, but I could say something about this ball now. Like, what exactly is it about it that's worth exploring? So convenience sampling is about getting whoever's available. It's literally convenience. That was sort of the way that focus group approach I was talking about, like me recruiting for focus groups worked. I'm standing on the street, handing out flyers. Do people reply, right? And then yeah, that's it. Who's available? Who wants to take part in this? But then you can also have non-probability quota sampling, where like yeah, who's available, but now you have some limits. So yeah, with the not too many of this kind of respondent or that kind of respondent. And I hope this is this is a brief introduction to sampling logics, and I hope this is helpful for you to start thinking about the beginning of your projects. over the next few videos, I'm going to start exploring questions like how do people get information? How do you learn information? That's a very social science aspect of this now. It's no longer a broad scientific logic. It's the socialization part, right? How do you socially interact with someone to learn about them? So questions, how do you ask questions? How do you go about doing interviews, or how do you go about doing surveys or focus groups? And I'll try and break down those specific methodologies, what they might be useful for, and what you might want to watch out for in your preparation over the next few videos. And yeah, if you have any questions, if there's anything you want to add, anything you want to talk about for all this, I'd be glad to hear it. So drop a comment, contact me if you know me. And with all of that, have a good day, and I will see you soon. Thank you.